week 11, we have a new text. The English translation is from 1908, at least the version that I use for the readings, the excerpts. But the text appeared in 1907. It was a kind of instant book published in Italian as well as French and English and other languages at the same time. A global bestseller documenting an adventure with the automobile. The author spent more than 2 months on an Italian automobile called Itala that traveled from Beijing, China, leaving Beijing, the city of Beijing, on June 10th, and getting to Paris roughly 2 months later on August 10. About 10,000 miles traveled by an automobile, and that's not really the greatest feat documented, chronicled by the book. You have to imagine, and then you will picture the conditions of the road going through China, Mongolia, Siberia, and most of Russia. Conditions that were not favorable to any vehicle of the time. So we have here a book that is interesting, not simply because of what it tells us, but also for the images that were taken by the author and the context itself. We can look at the entire thing as both the endurance race and the book as a colossal marketing campaign for the automobile done in 1907, when we are at the cusp of the evolution, the industrial evolution of the technology, with the Model T coming and other industries, of course, adopting, copying the same assembly lines, strategies to mass produce the automobile. So with the prospect of the world changing dramatically in reference to mobility, a journalist writes not just for his own Italian newspaper, Corriere della Sera, but his articles are published in French and English, in Europe, and in the United States as well. So we'll examine this interesting test. I'll talk a little bit about the final exam, and you find a section with details and suggestions under week 11. And as I promised last week, the film this week will be another movie from 1971, focusing solely on the automobile, where the automobile is really central to the narrative, and that's Le Mans, produced by Steve McQueen's own production company. Although it didn't go well for him, he lost. He ran out of funds for a movie with a budget of $7.5 million, which was a lot of money at that point, and he had to surrender the rights to another production house, giving up on any earnings from the film and giving up on his own salary as an actor. He had budgeted $750,000 for himself as the protagonist of this. He never saw a dime from this film, which had a moderate success initially in the theaters, but was a long time success because it generated a cult following and has been selling copies for the next 50 years or so. In fact, up until a few years ago, you couldn't even find it on streaming platforms because they were selling DVDs at a good rate, and they didn't want to give up on that portion of their profits. Under week 11, you'll find this presentation in a PDF format, the presentation that I will use today. The title is the same as a paper that I gave at a conference in Los Angeles about this topic. So I just kept it for historical reasons. What are the core ideas that we will be discussing, talking about this book, documenting this long ride from China to France? On top, I put a quote from a passage that is included in its entirety in this presentation. It's a passage when the car on which the journalist is traveling has reached an important city in Siberia, one of the few cities with hundreds of thousands of people living in it. And there they meet a rich merchant who accompanies them for the next segment. So for a few hours, they have a fourth passengers. There was a mechanic / driver. There was the owner / driver, the journalist, and now you have this rich Russian merchant who is introduced to the new technology and really gets the bug, right? Is inebriated by the experience. And what causes this strong reaction in this passenger who's experiencing the car for the first time in his life, according to the narrator, Barzini, is the vertiginous delights of speed. And it's a nice phrase because it encapsulates this idea that when it comes to the interaction of the technology of the automobile with the body and mind of the users, whether they are passengers or drivers, goes beyond, in the case of the body, extending the function of the body. The car becomes, from this point of view, an extension of your legs, allows you to travel farther and faster. And it goes beyond your rational comprehension. You can make sense of the car, and of course the journalist is someone who thinks of himself as a pragmatic intellectual. But when he, the narrator, the journalist, looks at and describes the reactions of the passengers, of the users, of those exposed to the automobile, then he realizes how the nervous impression, the emotional reactions, the physical part of the ride can easily overwhelm both body and mind of the user. That is to say, he understands that the success of this technology is predicated upon the deep roots created by the experience of the technology itself. And again, the best comparison we can make to understand this representation of a new technology is with the cell phone, right? Because nobody 20 years ago anticipated the enormous success that smartphones would have, to the point where there were people dismissing the smartphone as a niche within the market of mobile phones. They didn't think that it would be more than a niche product within that market, which at that point had products that were limited to the primary function of communicating with other people, regardless of your position, as long as you were within a cell network. And instead, we understand now how the success of the smartphone had a lot to do with the way users interacted with it and appropriated the technology to make it a symbiotic part of their life, right? To the point where we all know people who couldn't survive without a smartphone for minutes or hours, or people who will have the phone not even on their nightstand, but they'll keep the phone in the bed even when they are asleep. So even in the case of the smartphone, there is something that goes beyond the body, the extension of a physical function, such as communication, and the rational mind to go deeper into the psyche of the user. Of course, it's a long trip, right? From Beijing to Paris, across most of Asia, on the Silk Road, the Tea Road, all those routes that have been used since the Middle Ages to bring supplies from east into the west of different natures. You may be familiar with the Silk Road because of Marco Polo, the Venetian explorer, and the success that silk had in early modern Europe. But tea was, up until the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, the most important product traveling from China into, into Europe. Most of the black tea consumed in Russia and in Central Europe came from China. And of course, it was transported with carriages pulled not so much by horses, but more often by different kinds of oxen and also camels and dromedaries. So during this long trip, clearly one of the themes has to be how traveling on the car makes you interact with the space differently. The car itself redefines the space around you and allows for a different interaction with nature. Another strong theme in the book is the aspiration to a symbiotic relationship with the car. Now, keep in mind that the journalist traveling on this car, he was a paid passenger. His newspaper, his employer, Corriere della Sera, a newspaper whose headquarters were and still are in Milan, one of the major newspapers in Italy at that point, paid 6,000 liras, an enormous amount of money, to the owner of the car to have the journalist taken on this ride so that he could write and publish articles. And then clearly they probably planned to make it into a book from the very beginning. So the journalist is looking at the use of the technology as an observer, because he's just a passenger, and in fact, barely a passenger, because yes, there is a third seat on the car. We'll look at pictures of the car, but that seat was never empty, was always occupied by supplies, by spare parts, by the tents that they were taken with them, because they would be often sleeping outside in tents. So he was really sitting on top of everything, or sitting on the side step by the side of the passengers, always risking to fall from the car if he fell asleep. And in fact, he did suffer a traumatic accident at some point. So he's looking at the mechanic slash driver Ettore and the owner slash driver Scipione as an outsider, but is already thinking that the ideal relationship between user and vehicle is a symbiotic relationship, where by sitting at the steering wheel, in front of the steering wheel, by steering the car, the user of the car can feel what is going on in the car, and the mechanic will see passages that show how the mechanic is spending time under the car, apparently just observing, just looking for cracks, just looking for potential breakdowns and trying to prevent anything like that to happen. And then there is the whole, the big picture, the big message, that is to say that we are on the brink in 1907 of an anthropological revolution because our ecosystem as humans will be soon occupied by technologies such as the automobile, the airplane, and similar motorcycles, of course. They already have the phones, they already have the portable cameras, and the book is also a celebration of the power of a portable camera for a journalist. The issue is, once our ecosystem is crowded with all kinds of new technologies, what impact will that have on the natural development of humans? How will humans adjust to the new ecosystem from a Darwinian perspective, right? Because in reference to the animal species, Darwin had taught his readers, not just the scientists, but anyone who was interested in it, that you have to either a species will adjust to a new environment, or that species will face extinction. That applied to the human ecosystem becomes more of a concern than when the industrial age began. Because the industrial age did not have such a pervasive effect on the lives of everyone, not as much as the automobile. From this point of view, the encounter of the journalist with the various populations of Asia, and whenever they stop in a place, people gather around the car. Whenever the car breaks down or is stuck in mud, people gather around, they're curious. And the journalist, interestingly, is as interested to the people reacting to the car as he is to the adventure of the car. The car is by far the protagonist of the book, but the second protagonist is not just the crew on board the car. It's the people around them, because the journalist is trying to look at the future. How will these people who are now exposed sometimes for the first time to an automobile coexist with these technologies? Will they be able to adapt? Do they have in their nature the intrinsic skills that are required to operate in a society where more and more things are done with the help of technologies? So it's the beginning of a revolution that will continue and is still going on, right? From the automobile as the first individual technology, not the train, not the ships, which required a crew to operate, an infrastructure, but something that I can make my own technology. It's a continuum from the automobile seen from this perspective to artificial intelligence, right? Which is the latest technological revolution. So keep in mind the intellectual fathers of this reflection on the technology. On one side, Darwin, the idea that any creature, including human beings, have to adjust to a new environment. And in order to adjust, they have to either discover skills they have or develop skills to adjust. And just to show how Darwin's influence extended to society in general, we have to mention Lombroso, a famous Italian criminologist and anthropologist whose books at the end of during the last 30 years of the 19th century were quickly translated into English. Somebody whose works were being read by other scholars of anthropology and criminology, even in the US, and studied by university students. And what would Lombroso do? He was convinced, armed with the foundational ideas of Darwin that humanity was not one species. The first subdivision, of course, was ethnic or racial, right? He was deeply convinced that every ethnic group, every nation is a different subspecies. But he was also convinced that people that occupy a certain social level or performed a certain role were in a profession in society were doing so because of their nature. So his extreme Darwinian view of society led him to believe that if someone is working on a farm, or if an anthropologist goes and looks and observes a large number of farmers, they would discover that most farmers work that job because nature made it a good fit for that job. To the point where he studied even, for example, the porters in Italy, with the idea that he would find biological evidence that people who picked that profession were made by nature for that exact task in life and society. But as a criminologist, he studied mostly criminals. Criminals and soldiers were the easiest populations where he could find case studies that he was allowed to observe, measure, etc. Right? Once he became famous, given his reputation, the Italian government would allow him to study soldiers, the soldiers who were being drafted into the army. At that point, the draft was 3 years, then 2 years in Italy, and criminals who were in jail. And he literally measured their bodies. He would measure the length of their bones, their skeletal structure, the shape of their skull. He was so convinced that everyone in a particular class, especially the lower classes, or those in a position of leadership, and everyone in a certain profession that required physical skills would be recognizable as a different natural type. And he was looking for the evidence. That is to say, if I observe someone without knowing what is their profession, or what is their social inclination, can I see the physical, material evidence that tells me that the best role for this person in life is working in a farm, working in a factory, working in other jobs, and in reference to crime, his ideal discovery would have been he was really trying to find a way to predict whether someone would become a criminal and therefore be a threat to society, to prevent criminals from damaging society with their criminal activities. He was truly convinced that at the end of his career, through the accumulation of data about mostly the physical characteristics of criminals, but also, of course, their mental inclinations, that he could develop some kind of matrix or test that would enable society to tell if someone had criminal inclinations before they embarked in criminal activities. Again, to him, this was not an absolute, meaning that he believed that most people in prisons ended up there because nature made them so. Not that every single criminal was like that, but it's still a quite radical understanding of criminality, and he applied that both to men and women, and especially in reference to women, you see the strong limitations of this theory, because the women he found in jail at that time were mostly prostitutes, which led him to believe that there was something in the nature of those women that led them to become prostitutes, rather than the social system, the circumstances that impeded women from accessing means, economic means to survive, and forced them into prostitution and being exploited. But keep in mind the intellectual context that imbued a narrative such as this one about the automobile in reference to the future, the technological future of humanity. That is to say, if we look at an Asian population from 1907, Barzini believed, the author, can we predict whether they have the skills to become commercial drivers or mechanics or workers in an automotive factory, and therefore be employed, be socially useful, and survive this technological revolution? Or will they be marginalized by this change and therefore, clearly in a colonialist view of the world, become subordinated to the West and the Western powers that seem to be so productive in reference to technologies and so at ease with those technologies, right? So the idea in Barzini's mind, the author of this book, about this journey from Beijing to Paris was that there will be soon a new ecosystem. And in many ways, he was right? Within 15, 20 years from 1907, there were millions of cars in the United States, tens of millions around the world. And this required a new mindset to interact with the environment and society, a new culture, of course, right? Where you make sense of the presence of technologies. You're able to integrate them in a value system that retains the idea of a purpose, right? Because we are in 1907, so purpose in life is still a great value, even to people like Barzini, who are secularized intellectuals, right? Nothing religious truly in this. And of course, last but not least, that there would be a new language developing to describe, explain, and operate these technologies. And there they are. This is the car that traveled from Beijing to Paris and was the first one out of 5 vehicles that left Beijing on June 10th to arrive in Paris, to be saluted by a crowd of hundreds of thousands of people who had been expecting. In fact, it was all planned. It was a media event. Even the arrival, people would be selling merchandise in the streets, pins, postcards, and other kinds of merchandise. Of course, copies of newspapers celebrating the winners. In this picture, taken by the journalist, so these are the mechanic and the owner, and Barzini is the one taking the picture outside of the car. They're about to cross from Siberia into eastern Russia. And because there are no roads that are good enough for a car, they decide that the best way to proceed is to go on the road tracks. As we will see, they had problems with the roads, mostly because the car was very heavy, about 2 tons, about 4,500 pounds at the very least, plus all the equipment on top of it, all the gasoline and water and oil. What you see here, for example, are giant tanks of about 150 liters each, so about 45 gallons each on each side, an additional tank, a smaller tank in here, but there was an additional tank for water because they knew they couldn't find water everywhere, and additional tanks for oil because oil, these cars, rudimentary cars, consumed a lot of oil. So what is that they do? The owner, who was an Italian aristocrat who spoke Russian, who had friends in the Russian aristocracy, it's 1907, the Bolshevik Revolution will come 10 years later to put an end to that world. but the Russian aristocracy was very cosmopolitan, very well connected with other Europeans. And so he calls the ministry, he calls some of his friends, he's well connected in Russia. They wait, but they soon get permission to travel on the railroad tracks. They stop all trains. And if you notice this one, I don't know if you can recognize it, but this would be a red flag, right? So that they can signal their presence on the tracks. And they travel for a few tens of miles on the track to then be able to advance on a regular road. Of course, I picked this picture because it's very symbolic. It represents the new technology taking over the old technology for mobility. The automobile taking the place of the train, and then, of course, being able to move in all directions, not just on the railroad tracks. The shorter man in here is Ettore Guizzardi, the mechanic, but most probably also the one who drove most of those 10,000 miles. Based on his long experience. And he had an interesting history that made him the prototype of the new humanity. I'll explain in a little bit. The man whose face you see behind all the equipment on top of the back of the car, which is where the third seat would have been. So this explains how the poor journalist Barzini, who was not very physically fit, could not travel comfortably, and he would have to sit here, put his ass here and his feet on the side step, hoping not to crash. But the man here is Prince Scipione Borghese, from an actual aristocratic Italian family going back to the Middle Ages, whose family had popes, and in whose palaces in Rome you would have found incredible works of art, some of which ended up later on in museums. Okay, and of course, in the back, besides all the equipment, as I said, they slept in tents, they cooked for themselves depending on the situation. These planks they used often in order to go through terrain that was too soft for the car. So in that situation, even nowadays, people who do off-roading will have similar planks. These days are made of light metal or hard plastic. Notice how many tires and spare wheels they have in the back, and lots of equipment. Of course, they have here the national Italian flag, because this is something that is meant to celebrate the prowess of the Italian people, the Italian technology. This is an Italian car after all. You can see how big the wheels are, probably 22 inches or even 24, right? Same size in front and the back, so that they wouldn't have to bring too many spare parts. I'm saying that because during this time, up until 1907, a lot of cars had bigger wheels in the back, smaller in the front. This was not the case. This entire car was produced by a famous automotive company called Itala, and which was in production until the early 1930s. But this model produced by them was custom made for this particular travel, made more robust so that it could travel all those miles on this kind of difficult terrain. Okay, so keep in mind the protagonists and the symbolic value of this kind of picture. But the book is full of symbolic pictures about the past and the present. In this situation, the railroad is the past. Not that they envision a future without it, but it's not the primary technology for future use, both commercial and military use. Okay, and of course you can see the helmets in here are fashioned after military helmets of the period, right? So let's talk about the various characters in the book who were there in real life. This is the prince. At the beginning of the book, you find this image of Prince Scipione Borghese, and this image itself is able to tell the profile of this person. Of course, it's being represented as someone who wants to be up to date on current events, but this is supposed to balance the fact that throughout the book, the prince is involved in a long series of decisions. He is the leader, not just the owner and the second driver of the car, although the book doesn't say enough to diminish the role of the prince, or give the proper recognition to poor Ettore. But as a decider, as the leader of the expedition, they wanted also to show him as someone who's taking decisions based on information, which is something that the journalist who wrote the book appreciates, right? He wants to be able to provide leaders with the correct information. In reference to this Darwinian view of the world, the prince is a natural leader. Remember the concept of natural aristocracy that we found, for example, in The Lightning Conductor? The idea that Molly, the daughter of the American millionaire who's doing this journey with Jack, who pretends to be a driver under the name of James, that she's falling in love with this driver, and if she feels guilty because she's not supposed to marry someone who is lower in social standing, much lower than she is. She's supposed to marry some kind of business aristocracy or European blood aristocracy. Remember how she then sees some qualities in James, right? And says, well, Daddy, she's writing to her father, Father, I truly believe that this man should have a different place in society, and given the possibility, he could rise to a position of leadership. Applied to this kind of person, in Barzini's view, Scipione Borghese is a prince by blood, right? Because he inherited the title. But he also has the natural skills to make him a leader, right? So he is the perfect model in many ways because he has a long tradition, the family, the connections, the influence, the social influence, the political clout, but he also can be recognized by anyone as a leader. He doesn't need to lean on his ancestry or his title to be recognized as a leader. He's a leader because he's physically fit, because he is quick, and because he can take decisions that are well made and will produce a successful outcome. Okay, so keep this in mind. We have a conservative ideology combining with some of a progressive image, because he belongs to the elites, although he was not directly involved in politics, didn't seek a political career at this point in his life. He was more interested in exploring a lesser known area of the world. For example, he traveled to the Middle East with and without the car before going to China. But he is in many ways the perfect member of the elite in society. However, the progressive element is that when you take someone like Ettore, an orphan, lost his father from the lower middle classes or lower classes, his father was a trained engineer. Clearly, this is also the kind of person who can be mobile in society, so socially mobile, and be successful because he has skills. So his background, his social background, his family would not really be enough to support his claim to success or his ambition, but the skills that nature gave him and his ability to operate the automobile endowed him with social mobility. So you have this combination of a conservative ideology. Many leaders are leaders because nature made them so, but a view of society where, in order to sustain and maintain growth, you have to allow people with skills such as Ettore to advance, be rewarded, become socially mobile. You don't want to keep them at the bottom because the whole machinery of social progress, economic progress, political progress in an imperialistic way would suffer from it. What's the story of Ettore? Ettore was a young kid, maybe 10 or 11, when he was traveling in central Italy on board the train of his father. So his father was conducting this train as the engineer. The train derailed, left the tracks, had an accident, and as it often happened, the locomotive took a lot of damage, and Ettore's father died. Passengers, of course, were injured as a result of the accident, and this happened fortuitously, happened not too far from one of the villas owned by the Borghese family in central Italy. So Ettore, and as a kid who had suffered minor injuries, but most importantly was traumatized by seeing his father dying, and the injured passengers are taken to this villa for triage and waiting for ambulances and doctors and paramedics for first assistance. And that's how Ettore, as a kid, gets to know the prince. And the prince takes him under his wing. He's now without a father. So his family is going to suffer an economic loss, right? Because they've lost their primary bread maker in a society where women are not afforded the same level of pay, or not even afforded, given access to certain positions, certain professions. So the prince pays for his studies, but he recognizes his talent for mechanical things. Probably his father had taught him a few things around trains, and it was apparent that the kid had this mechanical knack. So not only he receives a regular education, but he's sent to work with mechanics in shops. Later, he is sent to the Italian army, but placed in a unit where he can continue to work on the development of his mechanical skills. And then by the time he is a young man, he starts traveling with the prince, going to various places in Italy for long trips, and going, as I said, to Eastern Europe, to the Middle East. The fact that his new life as a mechanic, as a mechanical genius, begins from this mechanical accident of the train is seen as very symbolic in the book, right? The end of the train as the primary means of transportation and the end of his first stage of his life marks the beginning of his new life, where he can be thriving based on his mechanical skills. So it's like the train accident coming out of the locomotive wreck. From the wrecked locomotive is like his second birth, but it's a birth to the new world of the future, the new world of technologies. And again, he, more than the prince, is the mechanical man, is the man who can feel from vibrations, from the smell of the car, from the noise of the car, whether the car is all right or whether the car needs some maintenance, some interventions and repairs. He is the one who spends, even when they stop, spends a lot of time around the car because he represents this natural, spontaneous, symbiotic connection with the vehicle. The vehicle and Ettore are deeply connected. Unfortunately, the prince died relatively young in the late 1920s, I believe, and that was the end of the ambitions of Ettore. He, of course, continued to work as a paid driver, as a mechanic. After World War II, a lot of people would seek him until he died in the early 1960s for interviews about this big adventure and other trips, other memories from the past. He, at some point, went back to his own small village in northern Italy. I think his village was called Budrio. But in the book is the new hero, someone from the lower classes who has the ability or the potential to climb the social ladder because of new skills, mechanical skills that are now in demand, and therefore becomes the prototype for an entire segment of the population. And then you have the journalist. And this picture, again, tells a lot about him. He was in his early 30s. In 1907 was 32 or 33. But you can see that he's physically different. His demeanor, his face, everything is different. You look at this picture and you think, this guy is a geek. This guy is an intellectual. Prodigious writer, great journalist, someone who reinvented journalism as a foreign affairs expert, someone who traveled outside of Italy to write articles for Corriere della Sera. But what changed in his view of the profession as a journalist was that up until the end of the 19th century, people who went to other countries mostly wrote picturesque pieces, travel pieces, right? Pieces about the social customs of another country. He saw his mission as a journalist going abroad as vital to the plans of the government. He thought that his role as a journalist was to provide factual information about industrial progress, economic progress, military progress in other countries, so that successful models could be replicated in Italy. So he was not ashamed of being seen as such as an ethereal intellectual, right? So thin, so dreamy, because he really fashioned himself a brainiac, someone whose discoveries, understandings of other societies could infuse new ideas in his own country that could help Italy, which was a new country, right? Italy had been unified starting with 1861, 56 years before this adventure. Someone who could drive from the back seat, drive progress in his country. From the back seat, he recognized that he's no hero. He traveled a lot. He was in the middle of wars, rebellions. So clearly he had some guts, but not the most comfortable guy in social situations. Later on, when we went to World War I, his relationship with the soldiers was so bad that they made a song against him. Also because his reports from the front lines were completely in support of the government, who was sending hundreds of thousands of people to die in the trenches in the mountains of northern Italy, World War I. So not really someone, a social guy. Later on, because he wanted to serve the government, no matter who was the leader, he found himself enmeshed with fascism, a supporter of fascism from the beginning. When Mussolini was arrested in 1943, then liberated by the Germans, and a new fascist state was created in northern Italy, he once again offered his services to the new to the neo-fascist government called Repubblica di Salò, Salò Republic. By the time the war finished, of course, his reputation was tainted by his unbridled support of fascism, and he died in 1947, destitute. His family suffered the consequences of his political position, and also he died a sad man, right? Realizing his failures after imagining he would have a much better career. How did this came to be? This idea of sending cars across territories with virtually no practical roads in 1907. And why was this done? It all had to do with media consumption and the media industry. It doesn't start with the Beijing-to-Paris race. It starts even earlier. So this is a copy of Le Matin, which was a newspaper which was born in the 1880s with American dollars, was supposed to be a global newspaper to be published in France and other countries. The American investors withdrew their financial support, couldn't understand what was going on, but one of the founders bought back the newspaper and continued in France. This new newspaper, within 10 years, they had 100,000 readers every day. People were paying to buy the newspaper every day. Within what would be 30 years, by 1914, they had 700,000 readers every day. Imagine growing a newspaper so much, and newspapers were an industry. People did make money in the past selling newspapers. How did they manage such a quick growth? Two things. One, you can see already from the top right corner. What is that you see here? A telegraph pole with telegraph wires, right? These are the wires transporting messages. And in fact, the title is Le Matin, the morning, meaning it's a morning newspaper. Keep in mind, in the past, even as far as the 1980s in Europe, you would find newspapers 2 or 3 times a day. So you could buy a newspaper in the morning, a different newspaper in the afternoon, a different one in the evening, so that they could be closer to the cycle of the news, right? Because by noon or by 5 p.m., things would have developed. In this case, Le Matin qualifies itself as a journal, as a newspaper you buy in the morning. And then the subtitle is The Last Telegrams of the Night, meaning we have the freshest news because we can rely on this speedy way of transmitting news, which is the telegraph, so that from all over the world, the most important, most relevant news are published in real time. And underneath, you find the mission of the newspaper, right? Where it says that they're relying on wires, meaning telegrams, from the 4 most important capital cities of the world. What were the most important capital cities of the world? Of course, it was a very European view of the world. So it was Paris, first and foremost, London, Berlin, and New York, of course, New York, right? Because Washington is not important, but New York was. And you see the addresses of the agencies, of the offices of the newspaper there. So this one was one way to sell the newspaper, meaning saying, read this because these are the freshest, latest news because they get to us in minutes from New York or London. The other way was they drove the production of news. They drove the cycle by organizing events they could cover. And the automobile was a big part of that. In 1900, when the automobile was still a rarity, right? There weren't too many automobiles, but there was attention around this. They themselves organized the first race around France, the Tour de France with automobiles, with different legs, right? So one day they would travel from Paris, let's say, to Normandy, and another day from Normandy, from Cherbourg to Montpellier, etc. But this way they could cover the event they organized and make it a success, an economic success, by selling copies of their newspaper. So when we get to 1907 and this article about their new adventure, they have some experience at this, at creating the news, right? So you find different articles, right? Even if you look at this, you find an article against places where you gamble, right? Legal casinos, an article about a tragedy in a mine in Germany, and then an op-ed here. This was usually a political op-ed. And then first page, in this important position, right? On the first page, the far left and the far right are important positions. They catch a lot of attention from the readers. They have this proposal of a race or a journey to go from Paris to Pekin. Notice that the order is changed. They're not going as they would from France to China. They call it a prodigious challenge, an extraordinary challenge. And then they explain that the automobile has proved itself to be able to go over long distances. It's now a more reliable technology, but it's never been tested in such an extreme way. So they are themselves sponsoring. This is January 31st of 1907. They're sponsoring this race going from Paris, France, to Beijing, China. And why did they change the order? Because they understood economically that the arrival would be an event that could be exploited in various ways, selling copies of the newspapers in the streets, selling merchandise. So they thought, if we do it in Beijing, we will not control the sale of the newspapers. How can we sell Le Matin in the streets of Beijing, or merchandise produced by us or by affiliate companies? If we reverse it and the arrival is in Paris, then the Paris event will also be profitable. Okay, so they changed the order. So they were requesting, inviting people to register for the race, to send their application, to state that they were entering a vehicle in this race. In fact, this was January 31st, by March, especially after it was revealed that people would have to start their race in Beijing, which meant not only you needed to have a car that is ready, people who are skilled enough to travel those miles. More importantly, you needed to have the money to ship your car and spare parts from France or Italy all the way to China. At that point, most people withdrew from the race. And Le Matin said that unfortunately, the event was being cancelled. At that point, the Prince Scipione Borghese, who had entered his car, had already commissioned a custom-made car for this race, wrote publicly to the newspaper saying, I'm in regardless. Even if you cancel, I'll do it, because I like the idea. Based on the reputation alone of this aristocrat, from a well-known aristocratic family, well-known across Europe, and known for his previous adventures with the automobiles, the French newspaper decided to resume the planning of the race. And by June, they were finally ready to start the race. Again, this is from June 9th. Notice it says, from our special telegram, or through our special telegrams, and dispatches from the night, meaning the last news from the night. And on one side, they have a diplomatic event. On the other side, an update about the race, which is called Raid from Pekin to Paris. It was not supposed to be an actual race like the Indy 500. In fact, the prize for the first car entering Paris was supposed to be as a gentleman's token of appreciation, a symbolic prize, was supposed to be just a magnum bottle of champagne, just a bigger bottle of champagne, nothing more than that, right? That is to say, it was not about who would go there first, but showing what would happen if you try to travel from Beijing to Paris, whether it could be done or not. Notice also that they mentioned Barzini's name in here, because Barzini, who was being paid by Corriere della Sera, was publishing, his articles were being sold to Le Matin, to British newspapers, American newspapers. So while he was traveling, he was sending via telegram, sending his articles, and those articles were being published and read across the world. And this is the actual short article where it says that they're waiting for their passports with a seal of approval to be able to pass through various custom points, and they're ready to go the next morning. And then this is June 11th, the June 11th edition of Le Matin, where this time on the left, which is the most important part of the first page of a newspaper, traditionally, in son parti, they have left. Finally, they left Beijing for this race. 5 automobiles have left Beijing yesterday, and they're rolling across the Chinese plains, the Chinese steppes. Not entirely true. And then they have a pictorial with the itinerary, the drivers, they have a wonderful infographic, right? This is the approximate itinerary from Beijing through Manchuria, Siberia, Russia, and then it's not mentioned, but this would be Russia and Central Europe, and eventually Cologne, Germany, and Paris, France. There was no fixed itinerary. The drivers could choose any path. There weren't even strict rules against using other means to advance with the automobile. In fact, even the winning car at some point used a ferry to go across a lake in Russia. Okay, and we don't know for sure how many miles they drove. It could be between 12,000 kilometers, 16,000 kilometers, so that would be 8 to 10,000 miles. These are the protagonists. Prince Borghese, the owner of this car, the Itala, 2,000 kilos, which would be 4,500 pounds, 40 HP, probably 45 or 50 in real life, but 40 HP is much less than any car owned. There is no car, I can assure you, traveling the streets. Even the smallest cars, the Fiat 500, have double or triple the amount of horsepower. And we know he was the owner, but not necessarily the first driver. They also had a tricycle. Tricycles and quadricycles were very popular. The rationale was for the prince that a car very solid, very sturdy would survive the trip. In this case, their rationale in choosing a tricycle was if the vehicle is light, it will not sink in mud. They were the first victim. They were the first to withdraw from the race. Then we have two de Dion Bouton, very good cars, and their drivers are these two. And then we have a Belgian car, a Spiker, driven by this guy who was quite a character. Godard was not ready for this raid. He conned people into giving him money for the car, but he did such things that he was able to. This car was second in Paris, but by the time he reached Germany, he was arrested because he got money on loans that could never repay. He got spare parts from the factory that he sold to pocket the money. He did everything, and there is a whole literature about him. Okay? So it's an unprecedented raid. Raid would be used for a long endurance race across a continent. And this is the itinerary from the book written by Barzini, which also includes, I have a copy of the book, includes also a map that you can take out, and I made a picture and put it on the class wiki. This is much more detailed with dates, so you can see that it took them 16 days just to go across Mongolia. And you can see that when they reached Moscow, it was July 27th. And clearly, this was a deviation. They didn't have to go to St. Petersburg. It would have been quicker to advance in a straight line towards Central Europe. Only they were invited to be celebrated in St. Petersburg. And by that time, by July 27th, they had an advantage of more than a week, so they could afford a deviation. And finally, they made it look like it's a straight line, or almost a straight line, especially in the newspaper. But it was much more complicated. And how was the itinerary picked? It was not random. It was not just out of efficiency. They needed to be, wherever they went, close enough to some office where the journalist could send out an article. So not every day, but every 2 or 3 days, they needed to drive by an office. And in this case, they of course, Barzini took a picture of the clerk running this telegraph office and his daughter. In this case, when Barzini goes into the office, they offer him a book to sign where customers can sign in, and he realizes that he is the first one to sign. But why did they have a telegraph office in this region of China? Because, of course, the limitations of the technology were such that the message sent through the telegraph wires had to be relayed. The message faded. The electric message faded after a few hundred miles. So there would be an office receiving the message, let's say message going from Beijing all the way to London. They would decipher the message and send the message to the next station. And this is where they would travel in the vicinity of telegraph wires so that they could stop and send articles updating the world on what was going on. Don't forget the technology, the other technology in the book, which is the portable camera, right? Plenty of pictures taken by the journalist. And these pictures are not just pictures of the car, but pictures of the people they encounter. In this case, they are on a barge going across a Russian lake. And he takes pictures of these two kids and this woman because he is interested in other people. Knowing more about other people is considered a necessary kind of knowledge for governments in a colonialist era. The car is the other protagonist, right? And this gives you a sense of the conditions of the roads, right? And you know what happened even 35 years later to the advancing armies of Germany trying to send tanks, armored vehicles, trucks on roads that were not ready for such vehicles. But this also is a combination picture because the car is central, and you see Ettore driving the car. At the same time, you see, since they've stopped in this village to take the picture, possibly to buy supplies, the prince had spare parts and gasoline shipped at various points on their itinerary, and this is why they advanced so quickly, because they were ready. He invested his own money. And whenever they stop, of course, there are people gathering around the car. So the book is about the car doing all these miles, but it's also about the people's reactions to the passage of the cars as an indication of how well these people will do in a future inhabited by cars. However, there is a potential lie at the basis of the book. This is the car. You can see how big the car is. Again, Ettore was not a tall man, probably 5'3", but his body is tiny compared to the big vehicle. You can see that the planks are being mounted in this position to serve as mud guards. But you see that the car, compared to what you've seen before, is partially disassembled, right? You have just the engine, the pedals, the steering wheel, and then not even a seat. This is just a wooden crate. Nothing in the back. Neither of the big side tanks holding what we said, 48 gallons each, just a smaller tank in the back. Why this? Because they knew they could not advance with their car as it was supposed to function. They made the car as light as possible in Beijing because they knew they would have had to do this. For the first few hundreds of miles, they often had to advance pulled by Chinese porters. So the prince did two things. One, he explored the vicinity, the areas near Beijing, the conditions of the road, which roads would be best, mountain passes later on in that region. And then he hired a crew of Chinese porters that were called coolies at that time that traveled with them. Whenever the car could advance, they would advance at a slow pace, right? Followed by the Chinese porters. Whenever the car was stacked or had to cross a mountain pass that was too narrow and made it impossible, they would use human strength to advance. However, I said it's a potential lie only because when you read the first page of the introduction, the first thing they tell you is, if there is one thing we learned from this adventure, is that you cannot drive an automobile all the way from Beijing to Paris. And both the pictures and the text are very clear that it's only a partial success, no matter how big, that the car is not ready for this kind of global scale adventure, but certainly the car has shown promise and has made great progress. Okay?